My name is Kelly Brooke, and I'm 43 years old. 8 years ago, I married my second husband, and every year since has been filled with happiness. Our marriage is built on trust, love, and mutual respect. Unlike my first marriage, this one is peaceful. My husband is kind and considerate, always making sure we have time for each other no matter how busy his schedule gets. Every month he plans a special date, and this month was no different. It was our wedding anniversary, and he had gone out of his way to reserve a table at a fancy restaurant by the sea. The view was breathtaking, and I was looking forward to a perfect evening with him. As we enjoyed our meal, I couldn't help but reflect on how far my life had come. But fate has a funny way of turning things upside down, and that evening didn't go as planned. It was about to take a turn that I never saw coming, a turn that involved someone I thought I had left behind for good. After we finished our meal, my husband excused himself to use the restroom. I remained seated, admiring the stunning ocean view through the large windows. The soft crashing of waves brought back memories of all the wonderful times we had spent together. I smiled, thinking about how different my life was now compared to when I was married to Jeremy Clarkson, my ex-husband. Those were dark times, filled with emotional pain and insults that left deep scars. Just as I allowed myself to enjoy the present, I heard a voice behind me, one I hadn't heard in over 13 years. My heart sank as I turned around. There he was, Jeremy Clarkson. He hadn't changed much, still carrying that same air of arrogance I had grown to despise during our 10 years of marriage. The shock of seeing him in the same restaurant on what was supposed to be a beautiful evening shook me to my core. I wasn't prepared for this confrontation, especially not when I was supposed to be celebrating my anniversary with my loving husband. Jeremy didn't waste any time. He walked over to me with the same smug expression I remembered all too well. "Kelly, long time no see. Enjoying the view? I bet it looks a lot nicer when you're not the one paying the bill." His words cut through the air like a knife. It was the same old Jeremy, condescending and cruel, always trying to belittle others to make himself feel important. I looked around nervously, hoping my husband would come back soon. "Why are you here, Jeremy?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as possible. He pulled out the chair my husband had been sitting in and sat down without asking. "I should be asking you that," he sneered, his eyes filled with mockery. "A place like this is a bit too high-end for someone like you, isn't it? Or is this a special occasion where you get to pretend you belong?" His words stung, but I kept my composure. "It's our anniversary," I replied, trying not to let him get to me. But inside, I could feel the tension rising. Jeremy had always known how to push my buttons, and I feared what might happen if he kept it up. Jeremy laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the restaurant. "Ah, I see. Poor people always come to places like this for anniversaries. It's the only time they can afford it, right?" His arrogance was suffocating. I looked toward the restroom again, silently pleading for my husband to return. Jeremy's presence was like a black cloud hanging over what should have been a beautiful night. "Isn't there someone with you?" I asked, hoping to steer the conversation in a different direction. "Yeah," he said dismissively. "I sent her to pay the bill. Handling money is a woman's job, after all." I almost laughed at the irony. Jeremy had always been the type to belittle women, thinking of them as nothing more than accessories to his own success. As I glanced at his companion across the restaurant, I realized it was the same woman he had left me for 13 years ago. But time hadn't been kind to her. She looked tired, worn out from life with Jeremy. My heart ached for her, but I had no sympathy for Jeremy. He hadn't changed at all, still stuck in his toxic ways, still treating people like they were beneath him. Just as I was about to respond, I saw my husband walking back toward us. Relief washed over me. Jeremy's insults had stung, but I knew they couldn't touch me now. My husband had always been my shield, the one who lifted me up when I was down. As he approached, he must have sensed the tension. His eyes moved between Jeremy and me, quickly assessing the situation. "Is there something you need from my wife?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. Jeremy turned and looked at my husband with disdain. "Your wife?" This woman is your wife? I guess poor women always remarry poor men. He laughed again, but my husband didn't flinch. Please don't be rude, I said, my voice firmer now that my husband was by my side. My husband is a respectable man. Jeremy snorted. Respectable? Must be another word for broke. He glanced at my husband, sizing him up. Serenia, and I could tell Jeremy still thought he had the upper hand, but he had no idea who he was dealing with, and that was the key to what would happen next. Jeremy's arrogance had always been his downfall. He was blinded by his own inflated sense of self-worth, too proud to see the reality right in front of him. You must be just another low-class guy marrying a low-class woman, he said with a smirk, clearly trying to provoke my husband. I could feel the tension between them growing, but my husband remained calm. He didn't need to prove anything to Jeremy. He knew who he was, and that was enough. Just then, the waiter came by with our bill. My husband pulled out his wallet and handed over a sleek black card. Jeremy's eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time that evening, his smirk faltered. "Is that a black card?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Showing off a card like that here? You must have borrowed it." "There's no way you could afford that," he scoffed, but I could see the doubt creeping into his expression. My husband didn't bother responding to Jeremy's snide remarks. He simply thanked the waiter, stood up, and offered me his hand. "We're done here, Kelly," he said, his voice as calm as ever. Jeremy watched us in stunned silence as we walked away, leaving him to stew in his own confusion. As we made our way out of the restaurant, I could feel Jeremy's eyes burning into the back of my head. I knew this wasn't over. Jeremy was the type of man who couldn't stand being outdone, especially by someone he considered beneath him. Sure enough, the next day, he called me. His voice was completely different from the arrogant tone he had used the night before. "Kelly, it's been a while. Can we talk?" he said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the desperation beneath the surface. "What do you want, Jeremy?" I asked, already knowing what he was going to say. "About yesterday. I didn't mean all those things. I was just joking. Can you please talk to your husband? I can't afford to lose my job." His words were a jarring contrast to the way he had spoken to us the night before. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by fear. My husband had power, and Jeremy knew it. "I'm afraid it's too late for that," I replied, feeling a sense of satisfaction for the first time in years. Jeremy had always thought he was untouchable, but now, for the first time, he was facing the consequences of his actions. Jeremy's downfall had been set in motion the moment he decided to mock my husband. What he didn't know, and what had been revealed to him too late, was that my husband was not just a respectable man. He was the president of the very company Jeremy worked for. I had kept that detail from Jeremy all these years, knowing how he would react. Now, the truth had finally come to light, and Jeremy had no way out. "You've crossed too many lines, Jeremy," I told him over the phone. "It's not just about last night. My husband doesn't tolerate anyone insulting his wife, let alone someone who works under him." Jeremy was silent for a moment, likely processing the full weight of his situation. "But, you can't fire me? I've been with the company for years," he stammered, trying to find a way out. "That doesn't matter," I replied. "You've disrespected too many people, and now you're going to pay for it." The satisfaction in my voice was undeniable, and for the first time, Jeremy seemed to realize that this was a battle he couldn't win. Jeremy's voice wavered as he tried to salvage the situation. "Kelly, please, I didn't mean to hurt you. I just thought you were still the same person I used to know. I didn't realize how much you've changed." I couldn't help but laugh at the irony of his words. Jeremy had never really known me. During our marriage, he had only seen what he wanted to see. A woman who was beneath him, someone he could control and manipulate. He had never cared about my feelings, my ambitions, or my potential. "You're right about one thing," I said. "I have changed. I'm not the woman you once thought you could control. I've moved on, and I'm happier than I've ever been. But you're still the same." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Jeremy had no response, no comeback. He was out of options, and he knew it. The power dynamics had shifted, and for the first time in our long and complicated history, I was the one in control. The next day, Jeremy was called into the president's office. He must have known what was coming, but the reality of the situation still hit him hard. My husband, sitting behind his large mahogany desk, barely glanced at him as he walked in. "Jeremy, we need to talk about your future with the company," he said, his voice cold and distant. Jeremy, now pale and trembling, sat down in the chair across from him. "Please, sir, I didn't mean anything I said last night. I was drunk. I didn't know who you were," he pleaded, but my husband wasn't moved by his excuses. "That's not the point," he replied. "The way you treat people, especially women, is unacceptable. I've heard complaints from your female coworkers, and now, after what happened last night, I've decided that you're no longer a good fit for this company." Jeremy's face turned white. But my family. I can't lose this job," he stammered. My husband paused for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "There is one option," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Jeremy's eyes lit up with hope. "Anything. I'll do anything," he said quickly, leaning forward in his chair. My husband looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "We have a branch in Michigan. It's in a small, isolated town with a population of just a few hundred people. The previous manager quit due to loneliness, but if you're willing to take the position, you might be able to save your career." Jeremy's face fell as the weight of the offer sunk in. The Michigan branch was a dead end, a place where careers went to die. It was a punishment, not an opportunity, and Jeremy knew it, but he had no choice. "I'll take it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My husband nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Good. You leave at the end of the week." Jeremy stood up, defeated, and walked out of the office without another word. As he left, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Jeremy was finally facing the consequences of his actions, and for the first time in years, I felt truly free. Jeremy moved to Michigan with his wife, the same woman he had left me for all those years ago. But life in the small, isolated town was nothing like what they had imagined. The cold winters and the lack of social interaction began to take their toll. Within a year, Jeremy's wife had left him, filing for divorce and moving back to the city. Jeremy, now alone and miserable, tried his best to turn the failing branch around, but it was an impossible task. The town's population continued to decline, and no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't make the branch profitable. Eventually, after months of struggling, Jeremy submitted his resignation. He returned to the city, hoping to rebuild his life, but found that no one was willing to hire a disgraced former manager. His arrogance had finally caught up with him. He ended up working as a night clerk in a rundown store, living in a tiny apartment and reflecting on the choices he had made. Meanwhile, I continued to live a happy, fulfilling life with my husband, grateful every day that I had left Jeremy behind. The life I had now was everything I had ever dreamed of, and I couldn't have been more thankful for the second chance at happiness I had been given.